In the quiet dawn of 1891, the resilient heart of Kansas stirred.
The spring of 1891 came late to Millhaven, Kansas, and when it finally arrived, it brought Hadley Weston nothing but frozen ground, a fence that needed mending, and a cow that belonged to someone else. She heard the commotion before she saw it. Men shouting, horses blowing hard, and then moving through all of that noise like it simply did not apply to her. A speckled cow came walking down the slope from Silas Garrett's land, calm, unhurried, as if she had somewhere specific to be and had already decided she would get there. The cow crossed the property line without hesitating. She walked to the creek, drank slowly, then moved into the shade of the old cottonwood at the edge of Hadley's land and stood there, still, settled, like she had just come home after a long time away. Garrett's men pulled up at the fence line. Garrett himself rode over, looking more irritated than a man ought to be about livestock he had already decided to be rid of. He told Hadley the cow was trouble, wouldn't stay with the herd, wandered off every chance she got. Useless. Hadley looked at the animal standing quietly in the shade, breathing slow and easy, and thought that useless was an interesting word for something that seemed to know exactly what it wanted. She took the cow. That was the decision that changed everything. Not a bold decision, not a brave one, just a woman paying attention when everyone else had already stopped looking. The spring of 1891 came late to Millhaven, Kansas, and when it finally arrived, it came grudgingly, the way spring comes to the flat middle of the country when it has been a long winter and the land is in no hurry to be convinced otherwise. The mornings were still cold enough to see your breath. The ground still held the gray, compacted hardness of frozen earth that had not yet decided to relent. The grass was not green, but a pale, exhausted brown, the color of something that had survived a long difficulty and was not yet sure the difficulty was over. Only the creek ran with any conviction swollen from the snowmelt in the hills to the north, dark and cold and moving fast along the low edge of the Weston claim. Hadley was on her knees in the mud mending fence wire when she heard the commotion. Men shouting, horses blowing hard and fast. She straightened up, pressed her fist against the small of her back, where it had been complaining for the better part of an hour, and shaded her eyes against the low April sun. Coming down the long slope from the direction of Silas Garrett's land to the north were 3 riders on big working horses, and 1 cow that was not cooperating with anything the riders had in mind. The riders were waving ropes and hollering like the animal was dangerous. But the cow was not running. She was not startled. She was walking at her own measured pace, in her own chosen direction, with the kind of deliberate calm that made a person stop what they were doing and look twice. The kind that said she had already assessed the situation, made her decision, and the men behind her were simply details she had chosen not to engage with. Hadley set down the roll of wire. The cow crossed the property line between Garrett's land and Hadley's claim without slowing down, without hesitating. She walked directly to the creek, put her nose in the cold water, and drank slowly and thoughtfully, the way a person drinks when they have arrived somewhere after a long journey and are finally allowing themselves the satisfaction of it. When she had drunk what she wanted, she lifted her head, looked around the property with the measured, unhurried attention of someone taking stock of what they had arrived at, and then walked to the shade of the old cottonwood that stood at the bend in the creek bank. She stopped there, turned her head once ears swiveled forward, and looked back at the riders who had pulled up at the fence line. Then she stood perfectly still, like she had just come home after a long time away and recognized the place from something deeper than memory. Garrett's men sat their horses at the fence. Two of them wore the unconcealed relief of men who had been chasing something all morning and were glad to be done with it. The third, a younger hand named Pullum, lean and watchful, the kind of man who noticed things and did not talk about them, coiled his rope over the saddle horn and said nothing, just watched the cow in the cottonwood shade with an expression that gave nothing away. Silas Garrett himself came last, riding the big gray gelding he had ridden for the better part of 12 years at an unhurried walk. He was 58 years old that spring and carried all of it in the way he moved and occupied space wide through the shoulders, weathered in the face. The kind of man who had spent enough decades getting exactly what he wanted, that he had stopped feeling the need to appear to work at it. He owned the largest operation in the county by a wide margin. 300 head of cattle, 12 hired men, 1,100 acres of deeded and leased pasture, a house with real glass windows, and a parlor that nobody used. He sat on the Millhaven Land Commission and had for 11 years. When Garrett spoke, people wrote it down. When he did not speak, people read his silence. He pulled the gelding up at Hadley's fence and looked at the cow standing in the cottonwood shade, then looked at Hadley with the expression reserved for people he considered a temporary inconvenience. "Miss Weston," he said, tipping his hat without warmth. "That animal has been nothing but trouble since I brought her up from the sale barn last October. Won't stay with the herd. Wanders off every time you turn your back. I have had men wasting half a morning twice a week just tracking her down. I have had 6 months of it, and I am done with her." Hadley looked at the cow. She was speckled black and white, marked unevenly across her whole body like someone had dropped ink from a height and let it fall where it wanted. The markings were not pretty in any conventional sense, too random, too uneven. But they were striking, each patch distinct and definite, no two the same size or shape. The overall impression of something that had arrived at its own appearance through a process that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations. She was maybe 4 years old, solid through the body, healthy in every visible way, with dark, calm eyes that were watching the cottonwood branches move in the April wind, rather than paying any attention to the conversation being conducted about her future. "What are you planning to do with her?" Hadley asked. Garrett shrugged. "Sell her for beef today if nobody takes her off my hands. She gives decent milk when she feels cooperative about it, but I cannot run an operation that adjusts itself to one animal's preferences. She is yours if you want her. Otherwise, I am loading her on the slaughter wagon this afternoon." Hadley stood there for a moment without answering. The cow had moved a few steps deeper into the cottonwood shade and was now standing with one rear hoof cocked in the comfortable posture of an animal at rest, looking like a cow who had considered her options and arrived at a conclusion that satisfied her completely. She looked like a cow who knew something the people around her did not, and was not particularly interested in explaining it. Hadley had 40 acres and a dugout carved into a hillside, and a bank debt her father had left behind along with the deed. She kept 12 chickens and a small kitchen garden, and sold eggs in town when she had enough to spare. She had hay to last until June if she rationed it. She had $12 in a wooden box under the floorboard. She had no business taking on another animal. By every reasonable calculation available to her, she had no business at all. She said, "I will take her." Garrett looked mildly surprised, then relieved. He nodded once, told Pullum to leave the lead rope on the fence post, and turned the gelding back toward the north without another word. The sound of hoofbeats faded, and then there was nothing but wind in the dry grass, and the small sound of the creek running, and the cow breathing slow and easy under the cottonwood tree. Hadley collected the lead rope and walked toward the cow, slowly speaking low. Nothing specific, just the steady, unhurried tone of a voice making no demands. The cow's ears tracked toward her. She did not step back. When Hadley laid her palm flat on the animal's neck, the cow exhaled a long, slow, full-body release and leaned almost imperceptibly into the contact. That was that. Terms agreed. She spent the rest of that morning trying to lead the cow to the barn. The barn sat on the south side of the property, fully exposed to the open sky. No shade within 50 yards of it in any direction. The cow followed Hadley willingly enough along the creek path through the cottonwood shade, but stopped at the precise edge where the shadow ended and the open sun began. She stopped as if she had walked into an invisible wall. Hadley pulled gently on the rope. The cow leaned back against the pull with patient, absolute resistance, not defiant, not frightened, simply not moving. The way a river declines to flow uphill, something rooted deeper than stubbornness, deeper than habit, something that felt like preference, like knowledge. Dried corn from the apron pocket held no interest. Coaxing did not work, circling did not work, patience in every variety Hadley possessed did not work. The moment Hadley stepped back into the shade herself, the cow relaxed completely, chewed a mouthful of grass at the base of the cottonwood, and regarded the barn in the distance with what could only be described as mild disapproval. Not the disapproval of an animal that feared what lay ahead. The disapproval of someone presented with an unreasonable proposal who is waiting politely for a better one. Hadley sat down on a rock and looked at the animal. "You do not like the sun," she said aloud. She said it the way you say something when you need to hear it spoken to know if it holds up. The cow blinked once slowly. Hadley looked up at the wide, pale sky and then north at Garrett's land. All flat open pasture grass and sky for miles without a single tree to interrupt either of them. She thought about 6 months of Garrett's men chasing this animal and never understanding why she kept leaving. The cow had not been running away from something. She had been looking for something. Shade, a particular quality of ground, a place that matched what she needed. On Garrett's land, that place did not exist. Most animals adapted to whatever was arranged around them. This one had requirements, and the requirements were not negotiable. And she had stated them through her behavior plainly and without apology until the situation changed. Hadley spent the rest of that day watching. She let the lead rope go slack and followed at a distance of 20 feet, and the cow moved through the afternoon with the unhurried precision of something that knew exactly what it was doing. From the cottonwood to a cluster of wild mint along the creek bank, nearly 20 minutes there, selecting specific stems with a deliberateness that was almost fastidious, knowing which plants she wanted. From the mint to a patch of mixed clover and sweet clover near an old leaning fence post, a spot Hadley had walked past 100 times without giving it any thought. From the clover back to the water, where she drank measured pulls and then stood with the cold water running past her legs in the afternoon shade. Every choice deliberate. Shade, fresh growth, cool ground water. The animal was not wandering. She was foraging with the focused, intelligent purposefulness of a creature that understood something about its own needs and the landscape's capacity to meet them, and was applying that understanding methodically. By the time the light went orange across the western field, Hadley had an idea. She brought the milking stool and a clean pail back to the cottonwood set, the stool beside the cow, and sat down without ceremony. The cow turned her head once to verify who had arrived, then went back to grazing the last of the mint. Hadley's hands found the milking rhythm without thought. She had been doing it since she was 8, and it was as natural as walking. The milk came down smooth and rich and steady, more than she had expected from a single afternoon milking, and richer in color and weight than ordinary milk. The cream was already visible in the first pull, heavy and golden in the male ring light. The cow stood without complaint and without the small, impatient movements that most animals made when they had had enough. She stood like someone who has been waiting for the right arrangement to present itself and is now fully prepared to honor her end of it. The cream rose thick and deep yellow in the pan overnight. Hadley churned it 2 days later in the cool early morning, and the butter that came out was different from any butter she had made before. Deeper in color, almost gold. The flavor had something underneath the usual richness, faint and pleasant, layered an echo of the mint and clover, and something else she could not name. Not overwhelming, not strange. Present the way good things are present, quietly making everything around them better, without drawing attention to themselves. She tasted it twice. The second time was not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be sure she was not imagining it. She was not imagining it. She put a portion in a small crock and drove it to town on Friday. She left it at Celia Dunmore's dry goods store on consignment for 10 cents a pound and drove home without thinking much about it. Celia sent word 3 days later. The butter had sold the same afternoon. 2 women had bought it separately, neither knowing the other had, and both had come back the next morning asking for more. One of them, a woman named Aldrich, whose husband ran the mill 6 miles south, had said it was the best butter she had tasted since her mother's kitchen in Ohio 20 years ago, and she wanted to know where it came from and whether it would be available regularly. Hadley read the note twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded it and put it in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered. She walked back to the creek and looked at the cow for a long time. She had not planned this. She had not been clever or strategic. She had simply been paying attention, and the cow had showed her something 3 years of struggling on this land had not. The land had qualities she had not been using. The animal had knowledge she had not been asking for. All she had done was stop fighting both of them long enough to watch. That was the beginning. It did not feel like much at the time. Beginnings rarely do. Over the weeks that followed, Hadley expanded what she was doing with the deliberate patience of someone who has learned that rushing a good thing is the most reliable method of ruining it. She walked every foot of her 40 acres again, this time for discovery rather than management. She found a second patch of sweet clover near the northwest corner that she had been mowing down as a weed. She found the stand of wild yarrow along the rocky ridge and watched the cow investigate it one afternoon, grazing on it selectively, a few mouthfuls chosen carefully, the way you take medicine rather than a meal. She found a low, wet area near the southeast corner, where watercress grew thick and the soil stayed cool even in dry weeks. She began to understand that her land was not just grass. It was a pharmacy and a larder and an intricate system of nutrition and flavor that had been sitting there untouched because nobody had known to look for it. The cow had known. And she was showing Hadley how to read it. She bought a cloth notebook from the dry goods store for 5 cents and began keeping records every day. What the cow had grazed where she had been, how much milk she gave, how the cream looked overnight, the weather, the temperature, what the butter tasted like after different days grazing. The notes were rough and unscientific. The observations of a woman who had never studied anything formally and knew it. But patterns emerged. When the cow spent the morning in the mint and clovers, cream had a sweetness that lasted through the churn and showed up in the finished butter as a faint, pleasant floral quality, unlike anything that came in tins from Ohio. When she grazed on the yarrow ridge, the butter had a sharper, earthier note that certain customers, the older ones, the ones with more experience in what good things could taste like, specifically sought out. By midsummer, she had 4 regular butter customers in Mill Haven. By late July, she had saved enough to buy lumber for a simple milking shed positioned in the permanent cool between the two elm clusters. She built it herself over a week of early mornings, setting posts and cutting boards the way her father had taught her on a Saturday when she was 9. The shed was not beautiful. It was solid, and it was hers. When the cow walked into it the first day and stood at the milking post without being tied, Hadley felt something she had not felt in a long time. Like the land beginning to work with her. The cooling channel she dug from the creek to the shed corner, lined with flat stones hauled from the creek bed one trip at a time. Cold running water for the milk pans. Not complicated engineering. Just a woman watching water move and understanding what that movement could do when you directed it. By the end of August, 8 regular customers and an inquiry from the hotel dining room. 20 covers a week, reliable on schedule. One cow had a ceiling. The ceiling was not enough for the hotel. She was working through that problem when Silas Garrett came back. A Thursday in late August, the sky gone white with heat. He rode in alone in his good coat, dressed for the conversation rather than the weather, and looked at everything. The shed, the fence panels, the water channel. He looked with the inventory eyes of a man who assigns a value to everything he observes. He said, "People in town are talking about your butter." Hadley said, "I know." He said, "That is the cow I gave you." She said, "Yes." He looked at the cow again with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that is not coming out the way he expected. "What are you feeding her?" "Same land as always," Hadley said. "Same water, same grasses and herbs that grow here. Nothing you could not find on any claim in this county." He looked at her, not with contempt anymore, with something more careful, something that was measuring. "People are saying the flavor is not natural." "The flavor is entirely natural," Hadley said. "That is the whole point." Garrett nodded slowly, filing it away. He looked around one more time. He said, "You are going to need more than one cow if you want to supply the hotel." She said, "I know that too." He rode away without another word, but he looked back once before he reached the road, and Hadley watched him go with the stillness of a woman who understands that something has shifted and cannot yet tell whether the shift is in her favor. She went inside and opened the ledger. August 28th, 1891. Need another cow. Need the right kind. A week later, Adeline Marsh arrived. She came on foot, 19 years old, small through the shoulders, wiry in the way of someone who had been working hard for years without complaint. Her dress had been mended at the hem and both elbows. Her boots were her best pair because they were her only pair. She carried a cloth bag with 2 changes of clothes and whatever dignity remains when everything else has been reduced to what fits in one bag. She stopped at the fence post by the road and called out whether Miss Weston was home. Hadley came to the door of the shed. The girl said her family's claim east of town had gone under the previous winter. Too much debt, not enough rain, the arithmetic of ruin. Her mother had gone to Missouri. There was no room. She had heard in town that Hadley Weston might be needing help. Hadley looked at the girl for a moment. Then she looked at the cow who had come to the fence rail to observe the new arrival, her dark eyes moving between the two people with steady attention. The girl was looking at the cow, not the way most people looked at livestock, not the calculation of utility. The way you look at something you respect. The way you look at something that has been through a difficulty and come out still itself. Hadley said, "The work is long days and early mornings and no guarantee of easy." The girl said, "I am not looking for easy. I am looking for work." Hadley said, "Room and board and $2 a week until I see how things go." The girl said, "That is fair." Her name was Ottiline, but she went by Ottie, and she learned by watching first and doing second, and never needed to be told the same thing more than once. She watched how Hadley moved around the cow, how she spoke. Before she touched, how she read the animal's mood from small signals. By the end of the first week, Ottie could milk alone. By the end of the second week, the cow was letting Ottie handle her feet, the last private territory of trust that cattle gave up the thing they held back longest. Ottie did not talk much. She would go entire mornings without saying a word, not about the work, and Hadley, who had worked in silence by necessity for 3 years, found she did not mind. The absence of unnecessary noise left room in the days for thought. She needed another cow. She needed to expand the system without losing the quality. She needed to manage the hotel inquiry carefully. She needed to do all of it while maintaining everything already in motion. The second cow came not through planning, but through the specific logic of things that are right for each other, eventually connecting. A man named Virgil Trent came by the 3rd week of September. A small operation 10 miles south, more chickens than cattle, and he had heard Hadley was looking. He had a young heifer, red and white, a good milker when she felt cooperative, but she would not stay in the pen no matter what he tried. He was done chasing her. Hadley rode out the next morning. The heifer was tied to a post in Trent's yard. Young, maybe 3 years old, healthy in all obvious ways, with a restless energy in how she shifted her weight. Not anxiety, but the constant low frustration of an animal that knows what it wants and cannot get there. She kept pulling toward a stand of clover just beyond the rope's reach neck, extended, determined. Hadley asked to walk the heifer around the property. Trent agreed. She untied the animal and let her lead. The heifer went straight to the clover grazed there with focused intensity, then moved to a shaded low spot along the south fence, then to a cluster of herbs at the base of the barn's north wall, then back to the clover. Not wandering, choosing, making decisions about the land the way someone decides what to order when they know what their body needs and are not willing to settle. Hadley bought her for less than Trent had hoped and led her home slowly, letting her stop when she wanted. When they reached the north pasture, she opened the gate and let both animals into the same space. The speckled cow looked up. The heifer looked back. They were still for a moment, reading each other thoroughly. Then they circled once slowly. Then both put their heads down and began grazing side by side in the elm shade, 3 feet apart, with the ease of animals that have recognized something in each other and have no further need to establish anything. She named the new one Brindle for the roan streaking in her coat. The speckled cow she named Dusk for the color of her patches in the evening light. With 2 cows, the work doubled, and so did the milk. By October, Hadley had accepted the hotel order and was churning 3 times a week. Audie handled the morning milking, while Hadley handled the delivery runs, and the arrangement worked with the quiet efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms and no longer negotiate them out loud. There was something in it that Hadley had not expected. She had told herself for 3 years that she preferred working alone. What she discovered was that she had not preferred it, but adapted to it the way a person adapts to working with one hand. Having Audie there restored something she had not known she was missing. And then, on a night in mid-October, Hadley woke to the sound of dusk lowing in distress. She pulled on her coat and boots, took the lantern from the hook, and went out into the cold. The night was still except for the wind moving low across the dry grass, and the sound from the north pasture, not pain, but agitation. The specific sound of an animal that has understood something is wrong and is announcing it. Hadley held the lantern up at the pasture fence. The gate was closed. The roadside fence line was intact. But along the back fence line, 30 yards from where Dusk stood, the wire had been cut. Not broken, cut. Cleanly in 2 separate places, with something sharp and purposeful, a gap wide enough to walk a cow through. Dusk stood at the near edge of the pasture facing the gap. She had not gone through it. She stood between the cut place and Brindle, who was further back near the elms, still chewing unaware. Dusk had positioned herself between the problem and the other animal, and she was standing there with the focused, unwavering attention of something that has assessed a threat and decided to hold its ground. Hadley walked the fence line with the lantern low. She found the cut wire at both points' ends still bright with fresh metal, the oxidizing not yet begun. She found boot prints in the mud along the fence's north side, 2 sets of men's prints walking in from the road and going back the same way heading north. And near the second cut point, in a patch of soft, damp ground, she found a 3rd print, smaller, narrower, the print of someone lighter who had stood there long enough to leave a clear impression. She crouched there in the cold and looked at the smaller print for a long time. The tracks led away north toward the road, toward Garrett's land. Dusk came to stand beside her, warm breath clouding in the night air, and pressed her forehead gently against Hadley's arm. Hadley put her hand on the cow's neck. "Something is wrong," she said quietly, just to herself, just to Dusk, who had known it before Hadley woke and had been standing guard over the knowing. She went inside and did not sleep until morning. When the gray light came up and she could see the cut fence clearly and the tracks going north, she understood what had been building quietly in the background of her life since April had now stepped into the open. Someone had come to her land at night with wire cutters and an intention. They had known the fence layout. They had known which pasture held the cows and how to reach it. That knowledge did not come from casual observation from the road. It came from someone who had been paying careful attention to this place from outside it over time, and who had recently been given detailed information about it. The cow had not left, but that was not the point. The point was that they had come at all. The morning after the fence cutting, Hadley rode into Millhaven before the stores opened. She went to the sheriff's office first. The sheriff was a man named Cord Beaumont, mid-50s, with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had seen enough trouble to know most of it resolved itself with time and not enough fuel. He listened to Hadley describe the cut wire and the boot prints without interrupting, wrote everything in his ledger in a careful hand, and then looked up at her with the expression of a man about to say something honest that she was not going to find useful. Hard to prove intent from boot prints, he said. Could have been someone cutting through on foot found the fence in the way. She said they cut it in 2 places and folded the wire ends back neat against the post. That is not someone passing through. Beaumont nodded. He said he would note it and ride out before the week was done. He said the best thing she could do was keep watch and not create a different kind of problem. She thanked him without warmth and left. At the hardware store, she bought a heavy iron bell and 40 feet of thin wire. That evening, she and Audie strung the bell across the repaired gap, threading the wire low through the grass along the fence line, so that a person walking in darkness would catch it with their shin before they reached the fence. Not a solution, an early warning. She knew the difference. Audie worked the wire without asking why. She had come out the previous night when she heard Hadley moving, stood in the pasture doorway with a lantern and looked at the cut fence and the tracks and said only what was necessary. She had the quality Hadley valued most, the ability to understand a situation without needing it explained, and to respond without drama. They doubled the wire at the cut points, reset the post deeper where the ground had been soft. Over the following week, 3 neighbors stopped by. An older homesteader named Gideon Sparrow pulled his wagon up at the road and called out to ask if the stories were true. When Hadley confirmed them plainly, he climbed down without being asked and spent 2 hours helping reset the corner post and retension the wire. When he was done, he told her that what she was building here was honest work, and he had seen enough of the other kind to know the difference and which one deserved to go on. Then he drove away without asking for anything. She was more grateful for that than she would have said under any circumstances. She was also watchful now in a way she had not been before. She told herself to be patient. Suspicion was not fact, and acting on suspicion before it became certainty had a way of damaging things worth preserving. So she watched Audie The way you watch something you do not want to be watching sideways at a distance without letting the watching show. Audie worked as she always worked. Early, thorough, quiet, reliable. The cow's trust was complete. Dusk would let Audie handle her feet, the last thing animals gave up. There was nothing in her behavior that looked like guilt, except on 3 separate evenings in the week after the fence cutting. Hadley noticed Audie standing at the northeast corner of the property in the last light, looking north toward Garrett's land. A minute, maybe 2, then turning back, saying nothing. Hadley filed it away and said nothing. Denton Hale arrived on a Thursday in the second week of September. He came in a well-kept wagon with a properly groomed horse, which told Hadley something about how the man thought about presentation before she had exchanged a word with him. 47 years old, solid and round-faced, and pleasant, wearing clothes that were expensive in the quiet, specific way of a man who wanted you to understand his wealth gradually, rather than immediately, at the moment most useful to him and least useful to you. He introduced himself as a produce merchant from Wichita. He had been hearing about the quality of butter and cheese from the Weston claim for several months and had come to see the operation. He represented buyers in Wichita and Kansas City, specifically looking for premium dairy product for hotel dining rooms and high-end provisions merchants. If what he had heard was accurate, he could offer a contract representing a significant step up from what she was currently managing. He said all of this pleasantly without pressure, and it sounded reasonable because it was reasonable. That was the thing about Denton Hale that Hadley would understand only over time. He was not a man who lied. He simply did not tell you everything. He offered a version of the truth accurate in every stated particular, but assembled to obscure the whole. Like a house that passes every inspection and has no foundation under the east wall, she showed him the operation. He walked behind her and asked intelligent questions about the rotational grazing, the herb pastures, the cheese aging she had been developing in the root cellar. He tasted the butter and young cheese. His reaction was genuine. The butter surprised him. She saw it in the small pause before he spoke. "This is unusual," he said. She said, "Yes." He said, "It is the grazing method." She said, "Partly." He looked at her, trying to calculate how much she understood about what she had. She let him look without giving him the answer, because letting people decide what you knew was often more useful than telling them. He delivered a contract the following week, handwritten in clean, careful script, 2 pages. The terms were good, better than the store rate, better than the hotel rate. A fixed price per pound guaranteed for 18 months with a volume commitment from his end. Exclusive regional distribution rights beyond her local Millhaven sales. First right of refusal on any production increase. She read the contract twice at the kitchen table, then a third time looking for what she was missing. She could not find it, which meant either the contract was exactly what it appeared, or what she was missing was not in the contract. It was somewhere else. It was in the situation the contract would eventually create. She told Hale she would decide within the week. Instead, she sent Audie to the dry goods store on Friday. Small towns were assembled from what people heard. Hadley needed to hear something. Audie came back that afternoon with the delivery receipt and one other thing. She stood in the shed doorway and said, "I heard something in town you should know." Hadley looked up from the cheese rack. A woman named Peterson at the store had mentioned in the offhand way of someone who assumes everyone already knows that Denton Hale had been through Millhaven before. About 2 years ago, autumn of 1889, he had approached 3 small farm operations with a similar contract. A provisions merchant he had called himself then too. All 3 families had signed. Within 14 months, all 3 had lost their land. Hadley was quiet for a moment, looking at the round in her hands. She said, "How did they lose it?" Audie said it happened in stages, the way the worst things did. The contract terms shifted gradually, small adjustments, each manageable alone. The families grew dependent on the contract income because the guaranteed price had let them stop diversifying. When the adjustments made the contract unprofitable, they had no fallback. 2 of them borrowed against their land to survive. Hale's name was on the notes through a holding company in Wichita. When they defaulted, the land transferred to the company. Not illegal, not dishonest in any specific provable way. The patient work of a man who understood how dependency was created and how long it took a family to realize they were inside one. Hadley set it down the cheese round and wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Audie said, "What will you do?" Hadley said, "I have not decided yet." She had more or less. What she had not decided was the shape of the refusal, how to say no, in a way that did not create an enemy she could not afford in a county where the men with money already had reasons to watch her closely. She was working through that when she found the second piece. She went to the Millhaven Savings Bank on a Tuesday morning to make her monthly payment on the land note, $30, the remnant of what her father had borrowed 11 years ago to put in an irrigation ditch that had never worked properly. 4 payments remaining before the note cleared entirely. The teller, a young man named Forsyth, took her payment, entered it in the ledger, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has just realized by the arrangement of their face that they have said more than they intended. He said, "You will want to confirm the new holder has this payment on record." Hadley said, "What new holder?" Forsyth looked at the ledger. The note had been sold to a private party in January. He had assumed she had been notified. He looked at her face and understood immediately that she had not. She asked who the new holder was. He gave her the company name, not Garrett's name, but a holding entity designed to say nothing about who was behind it. She asked for the registered agent. He did not have that information. She thanked him with a steadiness she did not feel and walked 2 doors down to the Land Commission office. The records clerk alderman had been in that office 22 years and found the registered agent for the company in 4 minutes. A law firm in Topeka. One that primarily represented, as she learned that week through Celia Dunmore's husband, who had done business with them, one category of client in western Kansas land matters. Silas Garrett. She drove home with that sitting in her chest, like cold stone. Not anger, arithmetic. Garrett had bought her father's note from the bank in January, 3 months before he had handed her the cow, 3 months before any of this had started. He had known about the note when he came to her fence line that April morning. He had known when he stood in her yard in August with his inventory eyes. He had held it the entire time, like a card he had not yet needed to play, waiting for the moment when playing it would end the game rather than simply advance it. Hale from the front, Garrett from behind. 2 men, 2 approaches, 1 intended outcome. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with the note and the contract and the ledger open together in front of her. The 3 instruments of the trap laid out where she could see the full shape of it. The note needed $120 to clear. She had $63 in savings. Revenue was down and unreliable because the summer had been dry and getting drier, and in the 3rd week of October, the dry became something worse. The rain stopped completely. Not the normal dry stretch of late autumn, a complete stoppage. The creek level dropped by 4 inches in 2 weeks, then 3 more. The mint along the creek bank yellowed. The grasses in the movable fence strips went from green to pale, exhausted brown. Hadley moved the pen more often, spending down reserves. She had planned to rest until spring, trying to find fresh growth for the animals. And then dusk went off her feed. A Monday morning, the cow at the hay rack without eating head down ears at an angle that was not quite distress, but was not right either. By Wednesday, she was eating only a few mouthfuls. Milk production dropped by nearly half. By Friday, it had dropped further, and what came down was thin and pale, lacking the rich depth that had made it what it was. No fever. Eyes clear. Not coughing, not grinding her teeth, not showing any sign of the diseases that took cattle in dry seasons. She was simply diminished. The drought had removed something the land had been providing, and without that provision, the cow could not be what she was. 3 hotel orders were canceled. A customer in town switched to the store's Topeka shipment. The provisions merchant in Junction City paused his standing order. The money stopped coming in the way it had been, and the silence where it had been was loud. Hadley increased the range she gave dusk in the afternoons, letting her roam further along the creek, following at a distance to see if the animals' foraging instincts would find something the drought had not taken. Not getting worse. Not getting better. Audie said nothing about any of it. She did what was needed, reduced her own rations, quietly took on extra fence work so Hadley could focus on the cows woke in the night when she heard dusk moving and went to check without being told. She was 20 years old and had the steadiness of someone who had already lost enough to understand that panic was energy spent on the wrong things. Denton Hale came back in the 3rd week of October with the same groomed horse and the same good coat and the smile of a man who believes circumstances have moved in his direction. He said he had not heard back about the contract. She said she had decided not to sign. He nodded slowly, the smile becoming something more patient. He said he understood the offer remained open, and as a courtesy, he said, using that word carefully, he wanted her to know he was aware the land note was coming up for review. He might be able to help with that as well. Not as a predator, he said, and used that word, the word of a man who had thought in advance about how he would deny being what he was. As a businessman who valued her operation, she listened without expression. When he finished, she said she appreciated him coming out and would be in touch if her thinking changed. He left. She watched the wagon until it was gone. Then she went inside, and for the first time since she had taken in the speckled cow, Hadley Weston let herself look directly at the possibility that she was going to lose. $120 to clear the note, $63 in savings, revenue down and unreliable, winter coming, Garrett holding the note. No family to borrow from, no husband, no one between her and the arithmetic. She took the note from the wooden box and laid it on the table. Hale's contract beside it, the ledger open to the current numbers, the shape of a trap in paper and ink patient and complete. She picked up her pen. The ink caught the lamplight dark and ready, and she held it over the contract for a moment that stretched. Outside, the wind came across the dry grass from a long way off, the way it sounds when there is nothing for miles to slow it. And then she heard something else. She looked up. Audie was standing in the open doorway without having knocked. Her dark eyes moving from Hadley's face to the contract, to the pen, and back to Hadley's face. She said nothing. She stood for a moment and then tilted her head very slightly toward the window. Hadley looked. Through the wavy glass in the blue-gray light of early evening, she could see the north pasture. The elm trees stripped bare now against the October sky. And underneath them, in the only green remaining in that corner, where the last late clover grew along the base of the roots, was dusk. The cow's head was down. She was eating, slowly, methodically, the way she ate when she had found something worth finding. Her ears were forward, her tail was still. Her whole body had the quality of concentrated attention that Hadley had been watching and learning from for 6 months. The first time in 2 weeks, she had grazed with that kind of focus. Hadley looked at the pen in her hand. She looked at the contract. She looked back out the window at the cow eating in the last light under the bare elm trees, finding the one green thing remaining in a dry season. She set the pen down, not a speech about it, not even a thought she could have put into words right then. She set the pen down and closed her fingers around nothing and felt the quality of a decision made in the body before the mind finishes its reasoning. The decision that had been there since April, waiting for her to get quiet enough to hear it. Audie stepped back from the doorway without a word. Hadley sat for a few more minutes, then folded the contract and set it aside and opened the ledger to the numbers again. She looked at them for a long time, not trying to change them, just looking at them plainly and asking a different question. Not how do I survive this, but what do I actually have, and what can I do with it that I have not tried yet? She stayed at the table until the lamp needed trimming and the wind had died down outside, and by the time she went to bed, she had the outline of something. Not a complete plan, just a direction. The first step of a path she could not see the end of, but could feel under her feet. It was enough. The next morning, she rose in the dark and went to the pasture before Audie was awake. Dusk was near the elms again. Alert now, eyes clear the way they had been all summer. She turned her head when she heard Hadley's footsteps on the frost-stiffened grass and made a low sound, not quite a greeting, but close enough. Hadley stood beside her in the cold and put her hand on the cow's neck and felt the warmth of her moving under the palm. "Still here," she said. "Both of us." The cow breathed a long white cloud into the cold morning air. Hadley went back inside and began to work. The morning after she set the pen down, Hadley sent Denton Hale a letter. It was not a long letter. She did not explain herself or justify her decision or offer the kind of elaborate reasoning that people sometimes use to soften a refusal and end up instead making it sound like an invitation to negotiate further. She wrote that she had considered his proposal carefully and had decided not to enter into any contractual arrangement at this time. She wrote that she wished him well in his business. She signed it with her full name, Hadley Ruth Weston, folded it, sealed it, and handed it to the postal rider on Wednesday without reading it again. Hale sent back a short reply 4 days later. He thanked her for her directness and said the offer remained open should circumstances change. He added at the bottom of the letter, in the same pleasant, unhurried tone that characterized everything he did, that he hoped she was aware the Weston land note would require attention before the end of the calendar year, and that he remained available to discuss arrangements of mutual benefit should she find herself in need of a conversation. She read the last line twice. Then she put the letter in the wooden box with the others and went back to work. She had 107 days until the end of the calendar year. She also had $63, 2 cows, a root cellar, with 16 rounds of cheese aging on the wooden racks, a cooling shed that worked, a movable pasture system that worked, and something that Denton Hale and Silas Garrett had apparently not considered worth including in their calculations. She had been paying attention for 2 years. In those 2 years, she had kept her ledger with the same diligence that other people applied to prayer. Every observation, every variation, every pattern that emerged from watching the land and the animals move through it together, across every kind of weather and every kind of season. She knew things about the relationship between the wild herbs in her pasture and the flavor of the milk that no one else in Mill Haven or the surrounding 3 counties had thought to investigate, because no one else had been watching the right thing long enough to see it. She knew that the clover in the northwest corner produced a butter with a different character than the creek bank clover, sweeter, lighter, the kind that certain customers had specifically described and requested without knowing how to name what they wanted. She knew that the cheese rounds she had been turning in the root cellar for the past 6 weeks, the ones started in April, made from the richest autumn milk and pressed harder and longer than the young cheese were approaching, something she had only tasted once before in a wedge of aged cheddar from Ohio that had cost more than most people in Mill Haven spent on cheese in a year. She cut into one of the rounds on a Thursday evening and tasted it the way you taste something you have been building toward for months and are afraid to find either better or worse than you hoped. It was better, considerably better. Dense and sharp and complex, with a long finish that came from the herbs and the age together, from the specific character of the milk and the cold of the stone root cellar, and the 47 days she had given it. It had the quality of completeness, the flavor of something assembled slowly over time, rather than produced all at once. She cut a second small wedge and held it in her mouth, and thought about the hotel dining room in Wichita she had heard about from a man at the feed store months ago. The one that had brought in a new head chef from back east, trying to establish the kind of table you would find in Chicago or St. Louis. She thought about what that kind of establishment paid for the kind of thing she was holding in her hand. She went to the ledger and did the arithmetic for an hour, working slowly, checking everything twice. Then she wrote a letter. Not to Hale, not to any current customer. To a provisions merchant in Wichita named Aldous Greer, whose name she had come across in a newspaper notice about the hotel resupply contract 6 weeks earlier. No connection, no introduction, no reference to smooth the path. She had only the letter itself and the accuracy of what she put in it. She described the product plainly without embellishment. The method, the rotational grazing, the wild herb pastures, the stone cellar aging with enough specificity to be believed, but not enough to be reproduced by someone who had not spent 2 years developing the knowledge behind it. She offered to send a sample at her own expense. She named a price per pound higher than anything in the Millhaven market by a significant margin, and stated it without apology and without hedging. She had learned that apologizing for your price was the same as telling the buyer your price was wrong. She sent the letter on Friday and began preparing the sample parcel the same afternoon, working by lamplight through the evening, cutting rounds, wrapping them in waxed cloth, packing them carefully in a small wooden crate with clean straw between each round. While she worked, she thought about the 107 days, then the 103. Then, as November came on cold and steady, the 91. She did not talk about the note to Audie. She did not talk about it to anyone. She worked the problem alone in the mornings before light, and the evenings after Audie had gone to her room, the way she worked all the problems that were truly hers, quietly, without audience, without performance. Dusk came back fully by the first week of November. Whatever the drought had taken from her, the cooler weather and the last of the autumn growth along the creek bed returned. Her milk came back to its summer richness within 10 days, thick and golden in the pan, the cream rising to nearly a third of the volume, the color and depth that had made it what it was restored, as if the drought had only been a pause rather than a permanent change. Hadley churned it into the last of the autumn butter and added it to the aging cellar, alongside the cheese rounds, the cold of the hillside, preserving everything through the weeks. Brindle had continued producing steadily through the drought months, and her milk had taken on qualities over the summer that it had not had when Hadley first brought her home from Trent's farm. The rotational grazing and the herb pastures had done their work on Brindle too. Her butter was honest and clean and consistent, and it sold steadily to customers who did not know the technical difference and simply knew they preferred it to anything else available. Hadley kept everything separate in the ledger. Every cow, every pasture strip, every batch of milk and cream and butter and cheese assigned its own line and its own numbers, because the numbers were the only honest account of what was actually happening. And she had long since decided she would rather face a hard truth than believe a comfortable story. Aldous Greer wrote back in 12 days. His letter was brief in the way of men who have many calls on their time. No pleasantries at the start. The substance in the first 2 paragraphs. The proposal in the third. He said he had received the sample and presented it to the head chef at the hotel dining room and to 2 other clients who dealt in premium provisions. He said the response had been, and he used the word himself, notable. He was interested in discussing terms for a regular supply arrangement. He named a price. It was 15% above what Hadley had asked. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat very still for a moment, with her hands flat on the table, feeling the solidity of the wood under her palms, feeling the particular realness of something that was actually happening in the real world. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back the same day, because men like Aldous Greer read speed and clarity as signals of a person who could be relied upon, and being relied upon was the foundation of everything she was building. She named the volume she could currently supply honest numbers, nothing inflated by optimism. She specified her terms payment within 10 days of delivery. No exclusive arrangement of any kind, no contract longer than 6 months before renegotiation. She said she could have the first delivery in Wichita within 3 weeks. She sent the letter and went to the root cellar and counted the rounds. 14 rounds of aged cheese ready, or nearly ready, the ones that had been turning on the wooden racks since April and May, given the full autumn to develop in the stone cold. At Greer's price, 14 rounds was a number she had not had in her hands at one time since she had taken on this land. Not a fortune, not comfort yet, but a specific sum that she knew and that the ledger confirmed. $140. She sat on the cold stone floor of the root cellar with her back against the shelf and her hands on her knees, and looked at the rounds in the dim light coming through the cellar door, and thought about Silas Garrett sitting at whatever table he used for his business, holding her father's note, waiting with the patience of a man who had always gotten what he waited for, because he had always arranged the circumstances so that waiting was sufficient. She thought not this time. She also thought with the clarity that surprised her by arriving without bitterness he had done her a kind of favor. Not intentionally, not in any way that diminished what he was. But the pressure of the past months, the fence cutting the note Hale's contract, the drought, all of it at once from different directions, had forced her to find what she was capable of in a way that easier circumstances might not have. The drought had pushed her deeper into the root cellar. The threat of losing the land had pushed her toward Wichita. Without both of those things bearing down at once, she might have stayed at the comfortable ceiling of her Millhaven customers for another year or two, never discovering that the floor under her was solid enough for something larger. She did not thank him for this. She simply noted it and moved on. The delivery to Wichita required planning. nearly 40 miles on roads adequate in summer and unpredictable in November's freeze and thaw. She needed to pack the cheese rounds carefully wrapped in waxed cloth and cushioned in straw against the movement of the wagon over a long day of travel. She needed to be there and back in 2 days, leaving before dawn on the first day and pushing through to arrive before the provisions district closed.
Audie said I can manage both milkings while you are gone.
Hadley looked at her. Audie said,
You have been thinking about whether to trust me with it. You have been thinking about it for a while.
Hadley said. Have I been obvious? Audie said.
Not to most people. I noticed because I know what you noticed.
A silence opened between them. The specific weight of something left unsaid too long and gathered heaviness in the not saying. Hadley said, The fence. Audie said, Yes. Hadley said, Tell me. Audie sat down on the bench near the shed wall and folded her hands in her lap with the directness of someone who has decided to stop carrying a thing alone and understands the setting down will cost something and is prepared to pay. She said she had known Silas Garrett all her life, not personally, but in the way everyone in the county knew him as a fact of the landscape, something that had always been there and that people navigated around rather than questioned. Her father had borrowed money from Garrett's holding company 9 years ago when grain prices dropped 2 years running. Her father paid it back eventually, but only after giving up the back 20 acres of their claim as a condition of the extension. That was how her family's land had shrunk from something viable to something too small to sustain itself through bad years. That was the arithmetic that had left her and her mother unable to survive when the drought came. She said she had come to Hadley's land in September, not only because she needed work, though she had needed it. She had come because she had heard what Hadley was building and wanted to be near something that might not break the way everything else she had known had broken. She had not come as a spy. She had not been sent by anyone. But in the second week of her time here, she had run into Pullum in town. Garrett's hand, the one from the morning of the cow, and Pullum had asked her conversational questions about how things were going at the Weston place. He made them seem like casual questions, the kind people ask in passing, and she had answered without thinking because she was 19 and tired, and had not yet learned to hear the difference between that kind of question and a real one. She had told him about the fence layout. She had told him which pasture Hadley used at night. She said she understood what that information had been used for. She had understood it the morning after the fence cutting, when she saw the boot prints and recognized the shape of her own carelessness in them. She had said nothing because she was ashamed and because she was afraid that saying something meant being sent away, and she had nowhere to go. She looked at Hadley steadily when she finished, not with tears or performed remorse, just the even gaze of someone who has said what is true and is prepared for whatever comes next. Hadley was quiet for a long time. She said, "Did you go back to Pullum after that?" Audie said, "No." Hadley said, "Did you tell him anything else before or after?" Audie said no. That one conversation was all of it. I did not know what it would be used for. I should have been more careful. I was not. Hadley walked to the shed door and looked out at the pasture. Dusk was near the elms, her breath making small clouds in the November air. Brindle was further back, grazing near the water channel. She said, "My father used to say that a mistake you understand is worth more than a success you don't." She paused. He was not wrong about much. He was right about that. She turned back. She said, "You will manage the milking while I am in Wichita. Both shifts, both cows." Audie said, "Yes." Hadley said, "And if Pullum or anyone connected to Garrett's operation comes by while I am gone, you do not answer questions about this property. Not the fence layout, not the rotation, not what we are producing, or how much." Audie said, "No, I won't." Hadley said, "All right." That was all she said about it. The matter was named and understood and set in its proper place, and continuing to press it would have served nothing except her own sense of grievance, which was not something she had time for. She left for Wichita 3 days later in the dark before dawn, the cheese rounds packed in straw in the wagon bed, the horse moving easily on the frozen road in the cold, clear air. She drove through the morning with the sun coming up behind her, the flat Kansas land rolling out ahead in the early light brown and gold and silver with frost. She thought about the numbers and the rounds and what she was going to say when she arrived. She had never walked into a business meeting in Wichita. She had never negotiated with a man of Greer's kind in that kind of setting. What she had was the product in the wagon bed and the knowledge in her ledger and 2 years of understanding that the most reliable form of confidence was being right about what you had. She arrived in Wichita in the late afternoon of the first day and found the provisions warehouse near the stockyards district. Greer was there, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with shrewd eyes and the kind of handshake that communicated more than most conversations. He examined the rounds one at a time, cutting into each with a small knife, tasting each cut with the focus of a man who had been doing this long enough to be genuinely engaged rather than performing it. He moved through all 14 rounds in order slowly without speaking until he had finished. He said, "These are the best I have seen come out of western Kansas." Hadley said, "I know." He looked at her. He said, "You are not shy about it." She said, "I am accurate about it." There is a difference. He paid her in cash as she had specified. He counted it out on his desk slowly, every bill placed face up where both parties could follow. When he reached the final bill, she put it in the inside pocket of her coat without ceremony and thanked him without excessive warmth, which he appeared to appreciate. He told her the hotel chef had already asked about a standing order for the spring season. He would handle that arrangement if she confirmed volume by the first of the year. He had 2 other clients who would want allocation once word spread. And word would spread, he said, because that was what happened with things that were genuinely different from everything else available in the market. She drove to a boarding house near the commercial district, paid for a room, ate a meal someone else had cooked, the first since the previous spring, and slept in a bed that was not her own, without dreaming. She left Wichita before light the next morning and was back in Mill Haven by mid-afternoon. She went directly to the Mill Haven Savings Bank. Forsyth was at his window. He looked up with the expression of a young man about to apologize for something he had no hand in creating. She said she was there to pay the Weston land note in full. He looked at her. She counted out the cash on the counter with the same deliberate method Greer had used: every bill visible, every bill countable. The full balance remaining, $120. Forsyth entered it in the ledger with the care of a man who understood this particular entry meant something beyond the bookkeeping. He issued the receipt, stamped it with the bank seal, signed it, handed it across. She held it for a moment. The paper was ordinary, same paper, same ink, same stamp as every other receipt in the bank. But what it said was not ordinary. Not to her. It said the last claim against this land was gone. The last instrument by which someone else could reach into her life and take what her father had built and what she had built after him was retired. She said, "The note is retired." Forsyth said, "Yes, ma'am, in full, as of today." She said, "Please make sure the recorded holder receives notification according to bank procedure." He said he would see to it personally. She thanked him and walked out of the bank into the cold November air. She stood on the board sidewalk for a moment with the ordinary noise of the town moving around her wagons, voices the wind that came off the prairie without stopping for anything. She felt something that took a moment to identify because it was not an emotion she had regular access to in this particular form. Not happiness exactly, not pride exactly, not simple relief, though it was closest to relief. It was the feeling of ground under her feet, solid and real and fully hers in a way it had not been since her father died and left her the land and the problems bundled together in the same inheritance without distinction. The problems were not all gone. The work was not finished. There would be other seasons and other difficulties, and the land would keep demanding whatever the land demanded. But the specific threat that Garrett had been building toward for 11 months, the patient mechanism he had constructed to take her land at her most vulnerable moment was gone. She had removed it herself on her own terms before the deadline he had been waiting for. 3 days later, Silas Garrett rode in. He came alone in his good coat on the gray gelding. He tied the horse at the post and walked to where Hadley was working near the milking shed and stood with his hat in his hands in the cold air. He looked older than he had in the summer, or perhaps she was looking at him differently. He said he had received notification from the bank about the note. She said, yes. He looked at her for a moment with an expression working through several calculations at once. 60 years old, and the largest man in this county for most of them. And what he was working through now was the experience of having been outmaneuvered by someone he had not taken seriously, and the particular adjustment that required. He said, "I underestimated you." She said, "You underestimated what I was paying attention to." He looked at the milking shed, at the movable fence panels stacked near the elm trees, at the cooling channel at the root cellar door set into the hillside, at the 2 cows moving in the pale winter light, grazing with the calm of animals that understood where they were. He looked at all of it for a long time. He said, "The note was a business decision." She said, "I know what it was." The silence between them was not unfriendly, but not warm. The silence of 2 people who understand each other precisely and have nothing left to obscure. He said, "The cow. When I gave her to you, I did not know what she was." Hadley looked at Dusk, who was at the elm base, nose down in the last of the autumn growth, unhurried and indifferent to the conversation happening 20 yards away. She said, "Neither did I. Not at first." Garrett nodded. He put his hat on and adjusted the brim with both hands. He said he hoped she had a good winter and that the spring would be kind to the pastures. He said it without irony, and she received it without irony because they were both people who understood the land well enough to mean it genuinely when they invoked it. He rode away north, and she watched him go until the gray gelding was nothing against the winter sky, and she did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more durable. The satisfaction of a problem correctly solved and correctly understood and set down completely. Denton Hale sent no further letters. Whatever calculation he had been running had arrived at a new answer, and the new answer did not include her. She was not sorry. Winter came hard in the first week of December. Snow piled against the north wall of the shed and along the fence lines and banked deep under the elm roots. The creek froze at the edges, leaving a narrow channel of dark moving water in the center that Hadley broke open with a pole each morning before the first milking so the cows could drink. She and Audie worked through the cold months with the steady rhythm of people who have learned each other's pace and stopped needing to negotiate it. Early mornings milking in the lamplit shed, with their breath clouding in the cold air. The slow work of churning by the stove, the butter coming out pale and firm in the winter cold, different from the summer butter in character, but still itself, still carrying something of what the land had put into it through the warm months. The cheese turning on the racks in the root cellar every 3 days without fail. Each round assessed with her hands and her nose, the language of quality becoming as natural as any language she had ever spoken. She wrote to Greer in the second week of December to confirm spring volume, a number 20% higher than the autumn delivery, accounting for both cows at full spring capacity. She asked for payment terms of 8 days from delivery rather than 10, not because she needed the 2 days, but because the tighter terms communicated something about where she stood. Greer agreed to everything within the week. On the 14th of December, in the late afternoon, when the light was going fast, and the cold,
had the specific sharpness of a clear winter evening, with hours of dropping still ahead of it. Audie came to the main room door and said simply that Hadley should come to the pasture.
Not urgently, level without inflection the way she said most things. But there was something in the particular quality of the steadiness that made Hadley set down the ledger immediately and take her coat from the hook. They walked to the north pasture together in the failing light. The snow was blue-gray around the elm trees, compressed and crystalline the shadows long across it from the low western sun. The air completely still in the way that winter air is still before a further temperature drop, a stillness that felt held rather than simply absent. Dusk was near the far elm, and beside her in the snow were two small shapes. Hadley stopped walking. The shapes were calves, two of them newborn, still wet the steam rising from them in the cold air. Dusk was standing over them with the focused and complete calm of a cow who has done what she came to do and is now fully occupied with the immediate work of making sure it takes. Both calves were already on their feet, unsteady, on legs still learning their own length, uncertain, but upright, already trying. Both were female. Both were speckled, not identically. One carried more black than white, the patches larger and more defined, the pattern reminiscent of dusk's markings, but its own arrangement of the same elements. The other had the coloring reversed, more white than black, with a scattering of smaller dark marks along her flanks and shoulders that caught the last of the winter light, like coal dust against snow. Hadley walked to them slowly, the snow crunching under her boots, and crouched down in front of the darker one. The calf looked at her with the wide, unfocused gaze of a creature in its first hour still organizing what the world was. Then the calf stepped forward on uncertain legs, 3 steps deliberate for all their uncertainty, and pressed her nose briefly against Hadley's outstretched hand. The same gesture Dusk had made on that first April morning under the cottonwood. The same quality of contact, not startled, not investigative, but deliberate. An acknowledgement. Here I am, here you are. Let us see how this goes. Hadley stayed crouched in the snow for a long while, with one hand on each calf, feeling the improbable warmth of them against her palms in the winter cold, and did not try to name what she was feeling, because it was larger than whatever name she might have found for it. The feeling of something completed and something begun at the same time. A line drawn from one moment to another that you had not known was being drawn until you could see both ends at once. Audie stood behind her without speaking, watching the 3 animals in the elm shadow with the quiet attention she brought to everything that mattered. After a while, Hadley stood up, her knees cold from the snow. She said, "We will need to get the straw bedding deeper tonight. Audie said I already started." Hadley looked at her. Audie said I figured. They walked back to the shed together in the dark, and the calves stayed close to Dusk under the elms, and the night came on cold and clear and full of stars over the flat Kansas land. The stars hard and bright, the way they are in winter, when there is nothing between you and them but cold air and distance.
She named the darker calf Wren for the small bird her father had always said was tougher than it looked, the bird that stayed through Kansas winters, when everything with the sense to leave had left. She named the lighter one Flint for the rock in the creek bed that struck sparks when you hit it right. Not the prettiest rock, not the most obvious one, but the one with something inside it that only revealed itself under the right kind of pressure.
She kept both of them. She had known she would before they were a day old. Through December and January and February, the 4 animals settled into the cold season rhythms of the farm with the ease of animals that are where they belong. The calves grew into their legs and began to show already the foraging instincts of their lineage moving through the pasture with purpose, even at their young age, pausing at the base of the elms with intent attention, investigating the same patches of ground their mother investigated. Hadley worked through the cold months with the methodical patience she had been learning since the April before. She turned the cheese rounds. She churned the winter butter. She wrote in the ledger every evening the entries growing from observations about one cow's habits into a full account of an operation that had its own logic and momentum, now its own patterns and tendencies. She was still in the process of fully understanding. She planned for the spring flush when the new growth would come up thick and production would increase and the delivery schedule would need to expand. She planned for a second larger root cellar dug deeper into the hillside where the temperature would be more stable, lined with mortared stone. She thought about a 3rd cow when the time was right, and a 4th, and thought about what the right kind meant, and trusted that she would know it when she saw it. She had learned to trust that. She added 2 more animals that spring, both found the same way she had found brindle animals that other people had given up on for reasons that turned out to be the very qualities she valued. One was a brown and white cow that would only drink from moving water, refused still ponds entirely. Her previous owner considered this an impossible inconvenience. Hadley put her on the creek side of the rotation and found the moving water produced a milk of unusual cleanliness and clarity. The other was an older cow, slow and deliberate in everything that 2 different farmers had tried to herd without success, because she would not be hurried. Hadley gave her a separate rotation and found her milk, while lower in volume than the others, had a richness that came from age, and from her particular thoroughness she missed nothing that was worth eating. She named the brown and white one Eddie for the current. She named the older one Clearwater for what her milk tasted like when you held it on the tongue. 6 animals, 40 acres, a system grown from watching one cow choose her own ground on an April morning in 1891, built on the principle that the animal knew something the farmer hadn't learned yet, and the work was to learn it. She said yes on the 1st of April, 1893, exactly 2 years to the month, after a speckled cow had walked down a slope and chosen the cottonwood shade at the edge of her land to the hotel chef's standing order. She said yes because the numbers said yes, and because she had been careful for 2 years not to say yes until she was certain, and she was certain.
The dairy shed she built that spring was a real building. The rough structure she had put up in the summer of 1891 had done what it needed to do, and she had been proud of the work in it. This was something else. Stone walls on two sides where the hillside gave her the material hauled from the creek bed in the same slow method she had used for the original cooling channel stones, one load at a time, planned over the winter and executed through April and May. Milled lumber from the carpenter in town for the other two walls. He did the framing while she and Audie did the interior work, fitting the shelves and the counter and the drainage channels with the knowledge of people who had been doing this work long enough to know precisely what they needed. The floor was flagstone laid level over packed earth. The stones fitted together with the care that comes from building something permanent, something you expect to stand for a long time. Shelves along the north wall from floor to ceiling, spaced at the exact measurement she had calculated from 2 years of knowing what the rounds needed and how they needed to be handled. A long slate counter along the south wall for the butter and cheese work, smooth and cool and easy to clean. 4 windows wide and south-facing for the light. The cooling system she improved that spring based on 2 years of watching the original and understanding where it fell short. She deepened the channel from the creek, lined it with mortared stone instead of dry laid, and created a branch that ran beneath the flagstone floor to keep the ambient temperature stable, even when the outside air turned warm in the long Kansas summer. It was not the system she had started with. It was the system that the first system had taught her to want, the system that could only have been designed by someone who had watched the original work and fail and work again through every kind of season for 2 full years. Audie managed the morning milking every day now, and 2 days a week handled the full dairy work, while Hadley made the delivery runs or attended to the business side of what they were building. She had grown into the work the way people grow into the work they are suited for, not by getting larger, but by becoming more precisely herself within it. The girl who had arrived at the fence post with a mended dress and a cloth bag had become someone Hadley trusted completely with the part of the operation that mattered most. The ledger had become a full account book, 3 volumes now. The first one, with its rough entries from the spring of 1891. The cramped handwriting of a woman still learning what she was tracking. The observations that had seemed important at the time and turned out to be important for reasons she had not yet understood, sat at the back of the wooden box alongside the retired land note and the first letter from Celia Dunmore and the bank receipt from the November day when the last claim against this land was paid and closed. People in Mill Haven had been calling it Weston Dairy for some time, though Hadley had not put up a sign. In the spring of 1893, after the new shed was finished and the calves had grown into their first season of proper grazing, and the waiting list from Wichita had acquired a third name, she had a sign made. She went to the carpenter on a Tuesday morning in late April and told him what she wanted. A piece of milled oak 2 feet wide, 2 inches thick, stained dark, and sealed against the weather. She had him carve the name in clean letters, even and deep enough to be read from the road, Weston Dairy. And below the name, smaller, but no less deeply cut a single line she had asked for specifically. The words her father had said to her more than once on the land he had loved and tried to keep, and had not been able to hold as long as he had hoped. Land doesn't lie. He had said it the way people say things they have learned from experience, rather than been taught with the weight of something tested, something that had proven itself true in circumstances that were not easy. The land would tell you what it was capable of if you were willing to listen. It would show you what you had done to it, whether you wanted to see or not. It kept its own account separate from any ledger, and the account was always accurate, always honest, always exactly what it was. She hung the sign on the gatepost herself on that Tuesday morning in late April, when the light was good and clear, and the cottonwood was in its first pale leaf along the creek bank, the new growth coming in soft and green against the gray of the older branches, the creek running with the spring melt full and cold and sure. Audie held the post steady while Hadley set the bracket and drove the fasteners with the mallet one at a time, solid and final. When it was done, they both stepped back and looked at it. The sign caught the morning light on the carved letters, the depth of the cuts throwing small shadows that made the name readable from the road, from the distance at which someone coming toward this land would first understand what they were approaching and what kind of place it was. Audie said, "It's right." Hadley said, "Yes." They stood there for a moment, the two of them in the spring morning, with the sound of the creek running behind them and the calves visible in the east pasture, running in the way that young animals run in spring when the ground is soft and the air is warm, and they have not yet learned to conserve anything. And the sign saying what it said over the gate of the land that had been fought for and kept and made into something. The land that a speckled cow had chosen on an April morning 2 years earlier by walking down a slope and standing in the shade of a cottonwood, as if she had been there before and knew it was right. Hadley had not been looking for what the cow had led her to. She had not known enough to look for it. She had simply paid attention when the cow chose her ground, and then again when the ground showed what it held, and again through every difficulty and every season, and the accumulation of that attention had become this, a sign on a post 6. Animals in a pasture, a root cellar full of rounds, a ledger in 3 volumes, and the particular quality of ground that is fully known and fully yours, the kind that holds you up without needing to be thought about. Then Hadley said, "The morning milking won't wait." Audie said no. They went back to work.